Mr. Tony Benn.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, if this debate is to make sense, we should understand the area of total agreement and where differences of opinion exist. There is nobody in the House who supports the regime of Saddam Hussein, who is a brutal dictator. I'll come to his support he had from the West, but he is, and nobody in any part of the House defends him. There is nobody in the House who can defend for one moment the denial by the Iraqi government of the implementation of the Security Council resolution, which said there should be inspections. I think the third issue on which there's major agreement but little understanding yet, and that is the sudden realization of the horror of modern chemical and biological weapons that do not depend on enormous hardware previously only available to a superpower, but which almost anybody, maybe even a terrorist group, could discover. Where there is a disagreement, it's not about those things, but how you deal with it. Because the former Prime Minister, whose contribution in this debate is listened to with great attention, was talking about a preventive war. I think, I'll read the Hansen carefully, but he talked about a preventive war. Now, there is no provision in the United Nations Charter for a preventive war. Indeed, if we're realistic, and we mustn't fool ourselves, that huge American fleet, what is it, 30 ships and 1,000 aircraft, is not in the Gulf waiting to be withdrawn when Saddam gives a friendly noise to Kofi Annan. That is a fleet sent there to be used. And the House would be deceiving itself if it thought that what's called diplomatic initiative would actually avert its use. Now tonight, and I say this with regret, I shall vote against the government motion, because the first victims of the bombing that I believe will be launched within a fortnight will be of innocent people, many if not most of whom would like to see Saddam removed. The former Prime Minister from Huntingdon talked about collateral damage. The military men are very clever. You don't talk about hydrogen bombs, but deterrence. You don't talk about people, you talk about collateral damage. You don't talk about power stations and sewage plants, you talk about assets. But the reality is that innocent people will be killed if the House votes tonight, as it manifestly will, to give the government the authority for military action. I also believe it would be in breach of the United Nations Charter. I don't want to argue on legal terms, but if the honourable gentleman who's just spoken has read Articles 41 and 42, he will know it says that military action can only be taken by the Security Council under the Military Staffs Committee, and that has not been done and cannot be done because the 5 permanent members have to agree, and they didn't agree. Even the Korean War, the United States, because Russia was absent, had to go to the General Assembly to get authority, and that was held to be a breach, but at least they got an overwhelming majority there. Now I come to the question of has there been any negotiation or diplomatic effort? Why hasn't the Foreign Secretary been in Baghdad, like the French Foreign Minister, the Turkish Foreign Minister, and the Russian Foreign? Because the time they said they wanted for negotiation has actually been used to prepare public opinion for war and give them time to build up their military position in the Gulf. And I believe Saddam will be strengthened again. They may kill Saddam, that's not impossible, because I read today that the security forces, who in other countries are described as terrorists, have been trying to kill Saddam, and it would not surprise me at all if they didn't succeed this time. But my fear is that the second action, which does not enjoy the support from elsewhere. There's no support from the neighbours of Iraq for this. If what he says about the neighbours is right, why is Iran against? Why is Jordan against? Why is Saudi Arabia against? Why is Turkey against? Where's this great support? There's no support inside from the opposition groups. The Kurds, the Shiites, the communists, none of them, they hate Saddam, but they do not wish to see the bombing. So the reality, and then the Pope is against it, 10 bishops, 2 cardinals, Boutros Ghali, Perez de Cuellar against it. The right honourable gentleman keeps cloaking himself with the garment of the world community, but I must tell him he hasn't got it. This is an Anglo-American preventive war, planned, and we are asked to authorise it in advance. Now, I say one word, if I may, because the House is very clear about its own view of history, but it doesn't say much about the history of the areas we deal with. Of course, the borders of Kuwait and Iraq were drawn by the British after the end of the Ottoman Empire. We drew those borders, which became sacrosanct. We used chemical weapons against the Iraqis in the 1930s. Air Chief Marshal Harris, who later flattened Dresden, was instructed to drop chemical weapons. And from the beginning of Saddam coming to power, he was a hero of the West. The United States used him against Iran because they hated the Khomeini. That was then the figure who had to be removed. They armed him, used him, sent him anthrax, and indeed the previous government, I'm not anxious to make a political point because I don't see much difference between the two sides on this matter, but the previous government, as the Scott report revealed, allowed him to be armed. I had 3 hours with the man in 1990 and got the hostages out, which perhaps made it worth going. But he felt betrayed by the United States because the American ambassador in Baghdad had said to him, if you go into Kuwait, we'll treat it as an Arab matter. Isn't that part of the history they know, even if we don't know it here? And I might add that in 1958, 40 years ago, Selwyn Lloyd, Foreign Secretary and later Speaker, he said to Foster Dulles, Britain's going to make Kuwait a crown colony. And Foster Dulles replied, said, what a very good idea. So if we don't know this history, in the Middle East it is known. Now the opposition have put down a motion saying what are the objectives, and I think it's a very good question, because there's no UN resolution saying Saddam has got to be toppled. And it's not at all clear to me that the present government here know what its objectives are, except they'll probably be told from Washington. Does it imagine you can bomb Saddam for 2 weeks and then he'll inspect? But he'll say, oh, by the way, do come in. I mean, the whole thing is completely misconceived. And the other point, it's been made by some speakers, even by the honourable members opposite, the double standard. Now, I'm not trying to equate Israel with Iraq, but Israel bombed Baghdad itself in 1981. On the 8th of June 1981, Israel bombed a nuclear reactor near Baghdad. What action did either party take on that matter? Israel is in breach of resolution. Israel has got instruments of mass destruction. Mordecai Vanunu is not a man who would boast about Israeli freedom. Turkey breached the United Nations when he went into northern Cyprus. Turkey's already recently invaded northern Iraq. Turkey has got instruments of mass destruction. All I'm saying is that it should apply to lawyers more than any other. If you're a lawyer, doesn't matter whether the man you're dealing with is a criminal thug or an ordinary lawbreaker. If the law is to apply, it must apply to all. And both governments have failed to do that. Now, I fear, of course, your prediction is difficult and dangerous, that this could end in a tragedy even for the American and British governments. Suez and Vietnam are not far from the minds of anyone who has any sense of history. And I recall Suez and what happened to Sir Anthony Eden. I heard him announce the ceasefire and saw him go on holiday to Golden Eye in Jamaica and come back to be replaced. I don't say it'll happen here, but if anyone thinks this House is in a position now just to piggyback on American power in the Middle East to run it forever, what happens if Iraq does break up? If the Kurds are free, they'll demand Kurdistan and destabilize Turkey. Well, anything could happen. And we are sitting here as if we were still the empire, only fortunately we have a bigger brother with more weapons than we do. And I'm very, very sorry that the British government, which have everything at their disposal there, on the Security Council, permanent member, president of the European Union this 6 months, where was that leadership in Europe we were promised? Where was it? It just disappeared. And, of course, also members of the Commonwealth, where there are great anxieties. I think we threw away our influence, which could have been used for moderation. Now, I'll finish finally with this, because I don't want to take up time. The amendment which I've put down with others on the order paper argues that the United Nations Security Council should decide the nature of what Kofi Annan brings back from Baghdad, should decide whether force is to be used. And, of course, inspection and sanctions go side by side, because, as I said, the sanctions are brutal for innocent people. And this is the real question, when is the world going to come to terms with the fact that chemical weapons are available to anybody? And if there is an answer to that, it must involve the most meticulous observation observation of international law, which I feel we are now abandoning. I finish just by saying this. War is an easy thing to talk about. There are not many people of the generation that remember it. The right honourable gentleman served with distinction in the last war. I never killed anyone, but I wore uniform. But I was in London in the Blitz in 1940, living in the Millbank Tower where I was born. Some different ideas have come in since. And every night I went down to the shelter in Thames House. Every morning I saw Dockland burning. 500 people were killed in Westminster one night by a landmine. It was terrifying. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little Channel 4 news item. Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with. And I finish with this. On October the 24th, 1945, and the former Prime Minister from Bexley, Old Sidcup, will remember it, the United Nations Charter was passed. And the words of that charter etched into my mind and move me even as I think of them. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save future generations, succeeding generations, from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. That was the pledge of that generation to this generation, and it would be the greatest betrayal of all if we voted to abandon the Charter and take unilateral action and pretend we were doing it in the name of the international community. And I shall vote against the motion for the reasons that I've given the House.